So the bottom line up front, based off of the 2008 Georgia-Russo conflict, was that Georgia basically suffered a swift loss and defeat in their campaign against the separatist territories following long geopolitical Cold War due to Russian influence within their borders. There were several key series of cyberspace attacks. Their underestimation of the influence, or the so-called peacekeeping operations, had, which has led to greater radicalization of territories beyond Ossetia and Abkhazia. So I went and conducted this analysis via the Starburst analysis to determine critical information requirements, primarily going off of who were the primary threat actors in this case study. First of all, we have the Georgian leadership and Russian leadership. We have hackers from both sides, alleged non-state actors, which can also fall in the category of these hackers, occupants and territories of Ossetia and Abkhazia, and pro-Western journalists, which could have an influence, which we'll get into here in a bit. Key actions that led to the outcomes. So here for the Starburst analysis, we're going to specifically focus on the what, where, when, and why. Going with the Georgian side first. The conflict began officially on 7th August 2008. However, tensions existed and continued to rise since the late 1980s, with the fall of the Soviet Union. And there were two smaller Civil War conflicts as well from 1991 and 1993 in those territories. The two separatist, ethnically mixed provinces believed that they wanted to maintain some sort of unity or a sense of unity with their struggles that they had coming out of the Soviet Union. They felt more aligned with the Soviet Union, according to Encyclopedia Princetonis. Eventually, a third territory, which was later reclaimed as Georgian again in 2003, following the Rose Rebellion, according to War on the Rocks in 2018. So there's been a lot of back and forth since the late 1980s leading up to the Georgian-Russo conflict in 2008. Georgian leadership also accuses Moscow of further escalating influence and radicalization of these city-states by their occupying presence and influence alone. However, Georgia government does not necessarily acknowledge these two locations as independent within their borders. There is a public denial of the independence of these territories and finger-pointing that escalates tensions in the area. So the how, via the SWOT analysis. Georgia strengths, diplomatic, and nonviolent efforts were taken prior to physical conflict to de-escalate, or that was the hope with the military buildup for 4 years. We saw an increased spending from 7.1% of government total GDP in 2003 to a high of 32.2% in 2006, with 3 consecutive years from 2004 to 2006 and 7 consecutive years at 20% or higher, according to Stockholm International Peace Research Institute military expenditure database. So this database basically lays out the overall spending of Georgia relative to a conflict. So maybe they foresaw this happening and they made preparations, which essentially they wanted to act as a deterrent to the Russian occupiers and deny their influence or hinder their influence within those territories that they believed were sovereign states to Georgia. Weaknesses of the Georgian leadership was that they underestimated Russian influence and their willingness to support their interest within its borders. During the Battle of the Town of Tashkanavalli, when they attacked the Ossetian territories and Russia responded in force with mechanized ammo, or mechanized armor units, Marines, and naval blockade. They were not prepared to handle that level of coordination. Russia's strengths, on the other hand, that were incorporated into the overall analysis of the conflict was that Russia understands the multi-domain warfare and how to strategically strike using proxy non-state actors to conduct 54 cyber attacks on key C2 elements, command and control, which enable them to set conditions to deal an effective blow, disabling other key warfighting functions for the adversary via distributed denial of service attacks in conjunction with synchronized air, land, and sea military actions. So they were able to hinder and limit the accessibility of the Georgians government and civilians to spread information and communicate effectively while simultaneously synchronizing attacks that lined up with the cyber attacks that were conducted. They holistically understand that the timing of these actions and the significance of elements of warfare have on the enemy's system and their ability to perform when met with multiple challenges. Weaknesses of the attacks were that the forces were spread out throughout the region and lacked any clear objective, other than to act as a deterrent to any forceful occupation by Georgian authorities. So there was really no guidance on the Russian invading forces. It was just a massive force, a show of force, and the conflict ended within a few days. There was a lack of unity of effort despite multiple preparation exercises years prior. There were still Soviet remnants making coordination difficult, and proved to be a logistical nightmare that Russian leadership was unprepared in multiple areas, including unsuccessful air attacks. According to the Chief of General Staff, Nikolai Makarov, in a Small Worlds and Insurgencies article in 2009, believed that these remnants of the Soviet Union were to blame for the lack of unity and the lack of clarification for the overall military might that was brought to Georgia. So this was kind of like a field test of a post-Soviet era. Georgia opportunities. Georgia learns that they are now vulnerable to their internet services, that they are more prone to cyber attacks, which provides them with opportunities to invest in more secure networks and platforms. So that is an opportunity that they, not necessarily a good thing, but it is a good thing knowing that they have these gaps and these shortfalls. This highlights to the community that they need to make better preparations for what's to come. Also, pro-Western journalists that caught wind of defacement could use these attacks as a means of propaganda for the campaign against Russia. So that was another opportunity that could come about from the actual attacks. There was also an increased attention to chat rooms, web activity, and trends, as well as other forms of communication via the World Wide Web, in order to intercept plans or strategies against nation states. So they were able to essentially intercept these data points, if you will, and relay them effectively and pass this information and disseminate it on to the proper authorities. And being able to know these trends before they happen, based off of what was happening prior to the build-up and the show of force and all of these exercises, they're able to potentially pinpoint events and prevent them, or mitigate at least, cyber attacks like this in the future. Attacks in the cyberspace domain may be indicators to intelligence analysts for preemptive strikes as well, prior to physical attacks or larger cyber attacks. So a few soft targets, maybe a couple of feints, and then they actually do the real cyber attack and or a conjunction synchronized physical attack. Some threats. So we understand that the Georgian failures were exploited, showing that the global criminal internet monopoly, that they and their citizens are vulnerable to these attacks. They're essentially easy targets based upon a 2009 lessons learned writing. So we are able to say that the civilians within these areas of operations, that are prone to these attacks are more vulnerable part of the population, because if they can get into the government's systems and networks, what makes you think, or the citizens think, that they are protected as well. So that's a big threat for the entire Georgian community, not just the government. The citizens have a loss of confidence as well in their government's ability to defend or respond to critical attacks and take back control of key resources like the oil pipelines, leaving other alternate energy sources vulnerable to the same fate. So a loss of confidence in the trust and the ability of the government to perform causes even more dissent and potential radicalization of more additional city-states within the Georgian territories. So again, a domino effect, if you will, based off of the actions that occurred. Russia opportunities. Through multiple strategic attacks in cyberspace, Russia further influenced the outcome of the conflict by denying communication. They were able to spread fear, create unknown situations, which set them up for an uncontested three-front invasion. Although Russia hackers didn't necessarily attack daily life-supporting infrastructure sites like oil, gas, and water delivery systems, which would have led to unnecessary deaths of the civilian populace, they possessed the capability to do so, and they demonstrated that with their attacks. The overall successful and devastating impacts that were essentially made through the preparation of the battle space beyond physical long-range fires, they were able to demonstrate that bombings to soften targets are not necessarily a viable option any longer, but it does prove to be a viable tool which enables physical warfare to be more lethal. So setting conditions via cyber attacks or other non-lethal means, via economic or whatever the case may be, they are able to then hinder the ability of the adversary or the opposing force to act in an appropriate manner. Also, this has been proven to be successful now. This is a timed, tried, and tested method that other nations may be in fear of or try to emulate. They may try to react to a feint, probing attack by hackers, and this overall deception and fear may divert resources critical to repelling or any sort of countermeasures away from the true target, making attacks like this a lot more vulnerable and easier by whatever entity that tries to do so. Threats for Russia: they have limited success in attacks against the Georgian hackers. There were some counterattack measures that were taken by some non-state actors potentially on the Georgian side. They were also limited success, but there were counterattacks, to say the least. So there is a dangerous precedent set for future actors in a similar manner, meaning the floodgates have been opened. They obviously are prepared to handle such activities to some extent, but they didn't have the early warning signs. So if Russia can, dish it out, they are also able to take it in a sense. They are not immune to it just because they were the ones to initiate first. Successful countermeasures could have been an early warning sign or a better prepare the Georgian government for physical attacks prolonging the conflict. So this was and still remains to be a potential threat in the future, is that if there were successful countermeasures, how would that have changed the overall operation? Could have been an early warning sign to the Georgian government, and they could have better prepared or withdrew, something along those lines to better equip and prepare the overall populace and military force. Some threats that I analyzed from both sides: if left unchecked or to their own agenda, non-state actors could cause damages essentially beyond the desired outcome of the state, as they have no boundaries, there's no control. Unless they're state-sponsored actors, they are able to act upon their own free will, causing damage and wreaking havoc across the entire nation. So that is a big threat to both sides that I was able to analyze. But overall, the conflict is something that should be revisited often, almost one that kind of foreshadows the events that are occurring in Ukraine since 2014 all the way up till today. Warfare has since been reimagined. I mean, attacks have been on the rise. There's been countermeasures sought after to protect vital interests, resource management, resources essentially that supply the physical component of warfighting. If you're able to hinder their ability to do their job or be accessed by cyber attacks and shutting down networks, grids, power structures, possibilities are kind of endless from there. The conflict also further highlights how non-state actors or proxies can actually influence the outcomes of reactions taken by a nation. So having a non-state actor or proxies do the bidding of a state or a nation kind of is like having your hand in the cookie jar, but if you get caught, it's not your fault, it's not your problem. It was somebody else doing your bidding. These non-state actors also may align with the adversary or even state-sponsored, yet it may never lead to physical conflict, but rather information war, psychological warfare, chemical, biological, or even cyber war, which all seek to cripple the enemy system, a cohesive system from within, deteriorating the response of nations and their abilities to their response time, and it can render them ineffective in its entirety or severely delayed. So this is my overall analysis of the 2008 Georgia-Russo conflict. Thank you.